All right, Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're here to talk a little bit about voter turnout in areas experiencing poverty. But before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your research?
Oh, sure. My name is Jeffrey Carroll. I'm an associate professor of political science at Chestnut Hill College here in Philadelphia. And I'm also the chair for the Center for Data and Society. My research and scholarship is generally in American politics, and I have a special emphasis on urban politics and urban affairs. And a subset of that is in Philadelphia politics and public policy.
So one of the key things that we're talking about and studying right now for our program, for our newsletter, is the correlation between poverty and lack of voter participation. And this is something you've done a lot of work on. Can you tell us a little bit about that work? And particularly, there's one paper I want to reference that we've spoken about before that I think is particularly useful in this discussion.
Oh, sure. I think that it's worth stating that what has driven me into social science is this discussion about poverty in Philadelphia and in general. Personally, I believe that it's studying social science is a gateway to best understand the conditions in which we live, and with an eye to thinking about how things are changing and if there's possibility for improvement in society. I've asked a number of questions in this domain over time, everything from education to criminal justice reform. And lately, my work has been situated squarely on some basics of democratic institutions, especially as it relates to voting. So the questions that you are asking me is just ones that is like what I think about all the time, and essentially keeps me up at night. I think the paper that you're referring to is the one that's on deep poverty and high turnout. It's a breakdown of the various wards and divisions and precincts of the city of Philadelphia, looking at it, looking at the demographic changes in it, and then thinking about voting patterns. That's essentially the methodology of the paper. However, the implications and where that work and others like it have driven me to just think about the people in the neighborhoods, with an eye towards the civic engagement of Philadelphia, and specifically the voting engagement in Philadelphia and how to better it.
So why do you see a lack of participation in areas that are experiencing poverty? Because you would think voting and choosing elected officials is one of the tools in the toolbox to help get out of poverty, advocating for different positions, things like that. Why do we see that?
Certainly, I believe intuitively that logic is absolutely sensible. However, we've known for quite some time that there are a myriad of obstacles in which poor folk find it difficult to engage in the political system. And there are these big bucket categories that this falls in. What I'd like to say first about this topic is that essentially, when we think about the experiences in which the impoverished go through, it's a mechanism of survival day after day. And for some folk, it's hour to hour. And to think about that in that way, certainly that voting matters, and the conditions of their lives matter. But certainly this is on a higher plane than what is on the forefront of poor folks' minds. However, so there is certainly this just idea about about the trust in government, the involvement in which this idea of political efficacy, excuse me, as it relates, excuse me, as it relates to poor people, but also the obstacles. Um, for example, just getting to the voting booth takes so many steps in understanding the rules about how to navigate state agencies, when the deadlines are, thinking about once you walk in there who the candidates are, many of which get turned away because of so many procedures that are barriers placed in front of poor people, that are intentional for the most part in preventing groups of people to vote. So taken together, there are these personal explanations of why uh, the impoverished don't vote there, and also too there are these institutional obstacles at that.
I'd like to bring in Ms. Murray here on Philadelphia.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. We really appreciate it. You were just talking about the institutional barriers and how some of these things might be intentional in terms of keeping poor people away from the polls. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yes, of course. Um, uh, Particularly over the I would say the last decade, the purposeful call for voter suppression is happening here, not just in the city of Philadelphia or across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but across the United States. This is very malicious behavior on behalf of states and localities that have made a calculus of how people win elections, essentially, and wanting to prevent people from voting. And the people that are most vulnerable to that are people of color, and oftentimes also to impoverished because of this intersection of race and class. Now, before, we used to have these very overt mechanisms to just disenfranchise people to vote. We would we would have poll taxes and this idea that if your grandfather voted in an election, you can vote in an election. Well, of course, you know that there were times through history, you know, let's say you're the first one voting after the Civil War and after the 15th Amendment, getting the right to vote. Your grandfather didn't, of course, vote in those elections. Okay, it had to be codified into law, the right to vote, this Voting Rights Act of 1965, and essentially has been just this struggle since then, to ensure that everyone, notwithstanding who they are, gets the opportunity to vote. But today, we don't have those overt mechanisms where there are poll taxes and there are literacy tests. Now it happens much more covertly. I believe that the crux of this is the debate, let's say, over voter ID. If implemented, it's study after study after study, and then places that have enacted a voter ID law have found that there is disenfranchisement, that meaning that people that show up to the poll and are inherently turned away from getting to vote. And then an extension of that study is who, again, people of color and poor people being disenfranchised. So that it could be one form of a mechanism that acts as a form of suppression. There are other kinds of malicious acts, such as moving a polling place, for example, as a means of not allowing somebody to vote. And at the federal level, we've actually walked back some of the provisions from the Voting Rights Act of 1965, via Shelby versus Holder, and this idea of preclearance, where the states had to actually have changes to their election law pre-approved by the federal government, which that Supreme Court case have actually disallowed that as of, I believe, 2013. So the environment in which to allow for voting suppression in the last decade has opened up and made it more amenable for this kind of malicious activity to happen.
Now, since we're still, kind of dealing with folks who don't believe that the last election actually happened the way it did, what part is that playing? What part could that play in terms of poor people getting out to vote? The fact that you have like people who are using election denial as a means of keeping people from the polls or saying they shouldn't be there.
Gosh, that is an excellent question, Denise. I believe that it does play a big role just in terms of political efficacy. Someone that is behooved to go vote and other kinds of political participation, let's say contacting their elected officials, even just paying attention to the operations of government and politics, warns that people are not turned off by the political process. And this idea of efficacy, it kind of waxes and wanes over time. But what I can say is that when there are times like this, of times of conflict, times in thinking of misinformation, times of untruths, these are very, very unsettling times, because what happens is that people, poor or not, begin to defect away from not only thinking about politics, but just not participating at all. So political participation will just wane. So I think that we are going to be studying these last couple of years for a very, very long time, for decades upon decades. Because the question that you asked is essentially that idea altogether about legitimacy, and accountability in government, and trust tied to someone's engagement with the system. And today, these are very, very unsettling times for that, where I believe that in terms of the citizenry, and particularly for poor folk, there are people that are not trusting at all, because it's driven by the thinking and then their experiences of that of behavior from our political elites, that are turning off just swaths of people in our society.
Now, speaking of our political elites, right now we're going through a mayor's race, and I've been talking to some of the mayoral candidates as part of this effort that we're doing on poverty and voting, about going out on the campaign trail with them when they go into areas that have been more closely associated with poverty. If I had a nickel for everybody who's invited me to go to Kensington with them, I could have retired last month and been very happy. But a lot of the folks that folks are going to be asked to vote on this time around have not only been, elected officials for a long time, but in some cases have represented these neighborhoods that seem to be in intractable poverty. And they only seem to get to really see their elected officials when it's campaign time. Does that play a part in the disconnection between voter turnout and poorer communities?
Excellent question. I believe that it does. I think that this parallels to this idea of trust, doesn't it? Of good folks in communities when there are problems. And I love this thing. Why I got into studying politics is and urban studies in particular is that all politics is local, right? Is that we can see when there's a pothole in our street. We can hear when there is a gunshot that goes off a couple of blocks away, right? We can experience, that when there is a nuisance bar on the corner where there's all kinds of activity, possibility of maybe violence happening in the middle of the night. And that idea is that these problems should be rectified, right? And that there is an attentiveness that needs to happen all the time and not just election time. But I would agree with that sentiment that folks, let's say these might be elected officials that represent the whole city or at-large candidates before they were running for mayor, where they represent the whole city, where I understand the sentiment from residents saying that they haven't been visible to me. I haven't seen you. I saw you. I may have seen you in 2019 or in 2015 or when there's an election or when you want us to vote. But these challenges are happening all of the time. And certainly it's that presence there in which citizens really do want constant visibility, and not just visibility, it's just attention in so many ways, attention that folks, elected officials, show up for forums to do problem solving, to do all of the to show up in the schools, right? To show up in the churches, right? To show up in the community centers, and on the playgrounds. And this is not during the times of just the ribbon cuttings or when there was a big event or they have some big sponsor that comes through. But for those things that are the little things but mean so much to us residents, right? The cleanups, because it's the opportunity to engage in that dialogue that will spill over to thinking about what are the other problems that are around and how can we best solve those problems and set up a foundation for communities to solve those problems, to be involved and participatory. And you can't be involved in participatory unless there's like true engagement, right? There has to be a foundation of trust that's there, that's built, and that's coordinated with our system of government, with the residents on the ground.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right, Dr. Carroll, where can people find more of your work?
You can find my work on my faculty webpage on Chestnut Hill College. There, I also have a personal website, JN Carroll, JNCARROLL.com, that has things like my CV, a summary of my scholarship and my teaching and service contributions there too. I also am on LinkedIn, so if someone were to type in Jeffrey Carroll, Chestnut Hill College, I would be glad to link with you there.
All right, Dr. Jeffrey Carroll, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.